I am Danny, also known as the Pavement Poet. You will typically find me travelling around from town to town, writing my poetry on the pavements, in streets, up and down the UK and Europe. This is the Pavement Poets Podcast. For many of us, the world that we've come to know is rapidly changing. Those with a reference point, I don't know, I suppose, if you've got memories going back to say the turn of the millennium and the years beforehand, will remember a world that was very much in transition. It started with technology, but it sort of moved beyond that, and we found ourselves existing in a world increasingly dominated by market interests. To give you some perspective, as it were, if we were to go back in time, there was a time when society, politics of that society, the social outcome was largely dictated by the whims of kings, clerics, who for a long time existed in a position of great power. But the problem was that over time, the people, the ruled, begun to resent this, and they started to ask for things like democracy. They started to ask for votes. They started to ask for more of a say in how their societies were run. What then came along was a shift in power, away from the clerics and the kings, who all of a sudden found themselves having checks and balances placed on their power, and a shift towards the power of politicians. But I know those of us with a historical context might look at the picture and start to see that ultimately history simply repeats. In the same way that the clerics and the kings had betrayed their power and betrayed their people, the politicians begun to do the same thing. So the people, ever existing in a state of response to this situation, placed checks and balances on the power of politicians. But yet now, fast forward to the modern world, we find ourselves shifting into an altogether new power paradigm. All of a sudden, the kings and the clerics aren't the ones with the power. The politicians aren't necessarily the ones with the power, and arguably only ever find themselves existing in a state of reaction to market forces. Pursue that logic, and it's not too difficult to see how, in actual fact, we now find ourselves existing in a world dominated by corporate interest and corporate influence. The following poem kind of touches on that subject. It's more of an observation of a world where history likes to repeat, albeit in different forms. If the kings don't rule England anymore, and the politician's word has come to draw, a standard which expects deceit, what then for their man in the street? If the market's grown to reach too tall, should crash, then burn into the floor, their normal man left to react, who is it that we give the sack? The kings don't rule England anymore, and a politician's reaction ain't worth my chalk. The markets, they rule England now, and leave me sat here screaming foul. If the kings don't rule England anymore, but the market's grown to be too tall, what then for their man in the street, who's only ever known deceit? The changing state of the world we found ourselves existing in post 2000 being the dominant theme of this podcast. I know many of you, cast your minds back, you'll have all too clear memories of those first years. 2001, the terror attacks in New York, subsequent war on terror with invasions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and military interventions in North Africa. All of this, it sort of created a world where we can't really be sure anymore in just how secure our personal situation may be. Whether travelling around our own countries, travelling abroad, the world as we knew it before that time simply doesn't exist anymore. Many people over the years have, I'm not going to say pointed fingers, but have raised questions as to the necessity for these interventions, the necessity for these wars, especially in a world where military interventionism, liberal interventionism is becoming a dominant theme. The following poem kind of touches on these subjects, and I like to think it asks the questions as to what purpose or agenda these situations serve. For example, it's no secret that in the immediate post 9/11 world, stocks, shares in arms companies skyrocketed. Whether it's the arms industry or the oil industry or even the financial industry, profiting from a crash, as we've seen in 2010, there always seems to be somebody in the background, whenever the global situation is worsening, who's profiting from these situations. I'm not here to get into the realm of conspiracy theories and say that it was all by design. None of us can say for sure. But whether it was or it was not by design, what undoubtedly remains true is that people have willfully benefited from these situations nonetheless. And when people are in a position to benefit from these situations, then we as a society need to start asking some very serious questions as to whether those entities, those corporate actors, perhaps wield too much power. At the dawning of ages of volume and guns, the lookout keeps watch with a view of what comes. Across the horizon with war clouds in tow, to reshape this world as the clock ticks in flow. They talk of expansion of markets, but greed is what drives these forces to grow and to feed. In places unheard of by folk in the West, who watch on their tellies, then rush off to bed. We know less than nothing, yet still fight their wars for profit, as poor folk lay dead on the floor. Their deaths a statistic to those in their suits who count out their silver and blood-stained gold loot. But what do we care when there's taxes to pay or mouths to be fed at the end of the day? Just go to your jobs and give this no more thought. It's not you they're bleeding to death on the floor. Everybody is in a bubble. Everybody is in a bubble. This post-turn the millennium world, it never stopped at wars on terror. It never stopped at corporate assertion of power. It's now gone further than ever before. In the 90s, it was very much the case that only the people in Cheltenham down at GCHQ could see what you're doing, monitor your emails, all strictly, as it was at the time, in the interests of national security or whatever it is. But now it's just a completely different world. You sign on to Facebook and there's cookies on your phone, and your every online movement is monitored. You sign on to Instagram and again there's cookies on your phone. Your every movement is monitored, reported back to the corporate entity, and you are then targeted with adverts based on your previous behaviours. All of these things taken together not only serve to infringe individual civil liberties, they also serve to increase the power of those corporate actors we spoke about earlier on in this podcast. The danger here is the way these algorithms, this rule by algorithm and rule by corporations, has pushed people further and further into their bubbles. For example, I can remember in the early days of Facebook when I was a university student, and back then the only way you could get onto Facebook was if you had a university email address, if you were studying at a university. That was the only way you could get on. The result of this was that some quite interesting conversations happened. You didn't have all these algorithms, you didn't have all this cyber surveillance capitalism as it has become. You just simply never had it. But now, fast forward to now, 2021, and all of a sudden there is a huge growth in surveillance capitalism. People are pushed more and more and more into their bubbles, and what this does is it creates polarization. Now, that in and of itself wouldn't necessarily be such an issue, but the problem with polarization is people become stuck in their bubbles and they become resistant to any idea which exists beyond their bubble. No longer is it just another opinion, it's now an enemy. to be confronted. And this mindset, this totalitarian, tyrannical mindset is now hit a point where it is as prevalent on the left as it is on the right, as it is in the centre. At no point in human history has the political centre itself so rigidly enforced its views in the same way, often done by extremists. I mean, normally, like you take this kind of intellectual approach to discussion, to theory, and you'd say, well, it's only extremists who think this way. It's only extremists who are closed to the views of others. But now it's everywhere. It's everyone. And the following poem kind of, I don't know, it doesn't so much touch upon that subject as it does touch upon the inevitable end point of that social situation. A world where people are stuck in bubbles, a world where we have become more polarized than at any point in human history, is a world that can only go in one direction. I feel a revolution stir the winds which carve this living earth, as people slowly start to rise and question those who sit too high. Revolt, I feel it in the air as tinderboxes start to flare all over these once peaceful streets where restless crowds they start to beat. The drums of protest with their song they knew the words to all along. The collective thought, now one of war on those who sit above the law. I feel a revolution stir the winds which carve this living earth, as powers fall and people rise with war on those who sit too high. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for now, but if you keep checking back, you'll be sure to find more, along with news on the upcoming book release.